The paint I'm using is from Magello Mission Gold set, and these are the main 4 colors I'm using for this painting. The paper is 300 GSM cold press 100% cotton watercolor paper. Firstly, I'm dampening the whole page. You can use a thick round brush like mine, or for a quicker or easier solution, you can also use a large flat brush. I frequently receive questions about how to avoid paper wrapping when applying a large amount of water like this. As you can see here, the paper is buckling in the middle. What I usually do is just ignore it and keep painting, but the paint may run towards either side. But if you don't really want to add paint while still wrapping, you can just do this washing process for about 2 or 3 minutes until it becomes flat. I'm adding ultramarine blue and dabbing it here and there on the paper first. This color in Magello is not very dispersive. The round brush can hold lots of water after you wash it, so I slightly dry it off, so that it has a similar amount of water as our page does at the moment. And then I'm adding some phthalo blue around the edges and in the middle where there's a blank area. There's no need to fill the whole page with color. We can just leave some white areas in between these colors. Phthalo blue has a very high tinting strength, so be careful not to add too much at once. At this stage, it's better to work with diluted paint rather than thick consistency, and the paper should stay wet the whole time. Now I'm adding some purple and green here and there. The whole painting is shifting towards cool tones, so I suggest you add cool colors, which can be bluish green rather than warm green. If you still want to add some warm green, just do not add too much. Our brush is still holding a certain amount of water, however it's not too much. It's going to enable us to blend the colors gently on the paper, as well as prevent the paper from getting too dry for the next step. This blending helps to soften some harsh and unnatural edges for the colors we just painted. Now I'm using clean napkin. I'm scrunching it into a roundish shape and pressing it down to lift some color from the background. We should dab the napkin at various angles to ensure the lifted patches have a natural look. If you aren't satisfied with current outcome, don't worry, we're not finished yet. One important thing to note is that after one lifting, the napkin will be stained. To avoid the color on the napkin transferring back to the paper, we should change to a new napkin or turn it inside out for a clean surface. Now I've finished all the flower patches. At this moment, the paper is still wet. Now I'm adding some thick phthalo blue to the background area. And be careful this time, we should use only a minimal amount of water on the paper to avoid obvious backgrounds on the background. This is probably the most challenging part for beginners if you're just starting out with watercolor. It's perfectly normal to find this a little challenging to control, but it will definitely become easier with some practice. Now I'm adding petals for flowers. Of course, the flower patches are nearly 100% dry, as we used a napkin to absorb the moisture minutes ago. And now I'm adding a bit of blue to the center of each cloud. And then I'm using a damp brush to extend the blue color into a petal shape. As the background is still wet, the backgrounds extending from the petals are unavoidable, so you can see the water traces are expanding, getting larger and larger. But that's alright, I will show you how to refine it after I finish painting all the flowers. I'm using dark and thick blue color to strengthen the background depth. This is an important step. Besides strengthening purpose, the step will cover the blotchy backgrounds from the last step and refine the unnatural shapes of the flower from the process of lifting it using a napkin. Keep the water minimal on your brush when doing this process. When adding thicker colors around the edges of the flowers, we want to avoid painting stiff outlines or covering the entire edge with a single solid color. Instead, we can just pick one side to add depth. After that, we can take the opportunity to darken the surrounding background slightly, so the added depth blends more naturally into the background. Once I've finished deepening the edges of all the flowers, I load my brush with the thick purple, making sure there's very little water on the brush, just enough to allow the paint to go on smoothly. Then I selectively paint bits of this purple onto the painting. By now, the paper is drier than before, so as you can see, the color no longer spreads naturally. This is where I use a clean, slightly dry brush to gently soften the edges by hand. You'll also notice that as the paper continues to dry, the colors on the page start to look less vibrant. So before it dries completely, I carefully add a bit more concentrated color to increase the depth. Just make sure not to overdo it or cover too much area. All the depths you want should be added during this stage, before the paper becomes completely dry. I'm taking the same green and purple that I used earlier for the background. I suggest you prepare 2 separate brushes for these colors to avoid adding extra water whilst switching between colors. This is the last step, which involves adding dark colors for this painting, so make sure you have achieved your desired depth and outcome before you wait for the paper to dry. Now I'm adding some white ink with a liner brush to create some dreamy elements. I splashed some ink, but the white ink was very thick and needed to be diluted to splash properly. Since it didn't work well, I used a brush to lift it off. And then I'm using some of the remaining white ink to add some small flowers in the foreground. Now I'm tearing the 4 sides of the paper to create that rough, deckled edge effect. If you're unsure about this, feel free to skip this step.